Hello, welcome to Stageworthy. I'm Phil Rickaby, the host and producer of this podcast. Stageworthy is Canada's theatre podcast, and on this podcast, I talk to theatre makers of all kinds, from actors to playwrights to directors and much more. Some of whom are household names, and others I really think you should get to know. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure that you hit that like button, and if you're enjoying this podcast, make sure that you are subscribed and hit that bell icon so that every time I put out a new episode, you get a notification that that episode is available. If you're listening to the audio only version, make sure that you are subscribed by searching in your favorite podcast app, search for Stageworthy, hit the subscribe or follow button. And while you're there, if you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, give me a rating and a review. Those ratings and reviews help new people to find this show. In a moment, I'm going to talk to you about my guest. And in this episode, I will be talking to Steven Hao. But first, let me talk to you a little bit about Patreon. I can't do this show without the patrons who've chosen to back me on Patreon. I put out this podcast for free, but there are still costs associated with creating a podcast like this. There are costs for website hosting, for hosting the files and distribution to all of the podcast networks, editing software, and so much more. And since I don't have advertising, the cost for all of those services is paid for by me. So if you want to help me make this show, and believe me, participating in the Patreon does help me to make this show, you can join the Patreon. Patrons get early access to episodes, and we have some conversations about issues and topics that I might want to cover. There's a few topics that I do want to cover, and if you join now, you'll get to take part in those conversations because I haven't actually posted about them yet, but there's some exciting stuff that I think is important that we'll need to talk about in the future and for the future of the theater industry and theater enjoyment in Canada. So if you enjoy Stageworthy, go to patreon.com/Stageworthy and become a patron. Now, as I mentioned, my guest is Steven Hao. Steven is a director, actor, and artistic director of Puckers. In this episode, we talk about Steven's time at the Stratford Festival. We talk about theater leadership in Canada. We talk about playwriting and the pathway for plays and so much more. This was a really fun conversation, so I hope you enjoy it. Here's my conversation with Steven Hao. Steven Hao, thank you so much for joining me. I am thrilled to be able to be talking to you. You mentioned just before we started recording, you are basically finishing up your season at the Stratford Festival. This is your third season, I think?
This is my second season. Yes, I'm going into my third. Yeah.
You were in the Anne of Green Gables show. You were in Salesman in China. What has your season at the Stratford Festival been like?
It's been great. Yeah, I started my first season last year doing Romeo and Juliet and Salesman in China, and this is my second season. I did Anne of Green Gables and Forgiveness. It's been a really wonderful time. I mean, Stratford was never like a place that I thought I'd be working at when I first entered the industry, not because I wasn't aware of it. It's only the most prestigious institution in Canada, but I sort of had developed passion or has spent majority of my time working dedicated towards new works. So that's a lot of where my realm of expertise lives in. And it just so happens that when I got brought over to do these shows, that they were all new plays. I was brought over to do Salesman in China last year, which was a new play. And then they kept me around for 2 more new plays. And then next year I'm going back to do another new play. So I'm excited that I'm able to use my skills even for an institution that sometimes as a priority is not always on new works.
I think it's thrilling to see that festival tackle new works. And I also think it's great to see that people are, and this might sound strange, but people are playing roles with lines in their first season. When I was in theater school, and this is in ancient times, this is a long time ago, but it was basically understood that when you went to the Stratford Festival, you would not speak for a minimum of 2 seasons. Like you were going to be like spear chucker in the background, and you might work your way up to some lines here and there. And in fact, those few people who at the time did manage to get roles often had a rough go of it. So I'm glad to see that like people can like enter into the festival and kind of make a mark from the beginning.
Yeah, I'm surprised by that as well, because when we were doing Salesman in China, there was a castmate of ours by the name of George Chang, who was the first Asian Canadian actor to appear at the festival 30 years ago. And that was kind of amazing because that last season was his second season. Technically, if we're going by the thing of like, how many seasons have you done? It was his second season ever. And his first season was 30 years ago. And he was the first Asian Canadian actor to appear at the festival. And like you said, 30 years ago when he was there, he was playing, spear carriers and plate bringers and yeah. So yeah, I think that institution, also just Canadian arts, has come a long way.
And it is such a important part of the Canadian theater landscape. Like it is, not only does it employ lots of people, but for many people, especially in Ontario, but in many places in Canada, it is the place where people are first exposed to classical theater and other forms of theater. Super important as part of the fabric of our industry.
Totally, yeah. It's a crucial place to exist in terms of just for the culture aspect of it all. Obviously, like I think since pandemic, we experienced something that we've never experienced before, and since coming out of the pandemic, it's been a long journey in recovering our audiences and also just sort of inserting ourselves back into what's in the popular culture, and having to compete with movie theaters and streaming and yada yada yada. So I think a place like that, yeah, I think the existence of it is super crucial.
And just generally like the theater trying to find or reconnect with its audience after the pandemic is kind of a huge issue. It's something that I think we're not fully reckoned with, how the landscape has changed and how comfortable people are not leaving their homes. What have you seen? I mean, you've been at the festival now for 2 seasons. What have you seen in terms of audiences, and what's your sense of audiences leaving their homes and coming to the theater?
Yeah, I mean, it's the funny thing, right? Because no matter what, like the experience you get to have at the theater remains unchanging. I think the new added element is the anxiety of still just sickness and whatnot. That's kind of sort of push people back a little bit. But like in terms of being back in the theater, there's still nothing that moves the audience to their feet the moment after like a big musical number, or like after a really devastating tragedy on stage. Like the audiences are still so engaged. And I think in terms of what this medium does for us before pandemic or after, like it still does that same thing, which is providing a really cathartic experience and allowing strangers to connect with each other in a big black room for however long the play is, right? So that essence has not changed. It's just that we definitely have lost some of that familiarity of how frequently people visit the theater, to having to earn them back a little bit more. But
Yeah.
But the essence remains the same.
Absolutely, the essence remains the same. So I think that to me, we've we've lost some of the traditional audience, right? Some of them, because I mean, I worked at Marvish theaters for ages, and so I know that the age of the average subscriber is very old, and I think every theater sort of experiences that, and there's a fine. You have to try to find ways to bring in people who haven't had the habit of going to the theater so much. And I think that one of the ways that we should probably be doing that is to be learn how to talk about what the magic of being in the room is. Like those things that you just described, it's so different from watching something on TV or even in a movie theater. It's immediate, and it's not just you're in the room with an audience, you're in the room with actors, and we have to, that is the experience, and we have to be able to, that's how we're going to bring people into the theater, by expressing to them what that's like.
100%, yeah. And I think a lot of that is I'm excited to see the new chapters of now theaters everywhere, not just in Toronto but in Canada, of trying to program more things and or engage in more work or engage in more directors who really understand how to, I think, bring that out of the audience. Like Anne of Green Gables has been such a unique experience because it is such a Canadian classic. So in a lot of ways, we were playing off of the safety of having a built-in audience for the show. But our director, writer, Cass Sandler did such a good job of crafting this story in such a unique way that it connects to the audience who was familiar with the work, but also audiences who's never experienced the work. And it sort of started to foster this new group of audiences for this story, as well as just for this play and this kind of structure of storytelling as a whole.
It's so interesting because that is, I mean, it is a play like that is a story that has been adapted in several different ways, a couple of times on television, a stage musical. In addition to a stage musical, if you go to the Charlottetown Festival, there across from where the musical is, there's another version of the story as well. It's like so there's a lot of familiarity, but it's Kat Sandler, so Kat has a way of attacking things in a very unique way.
Yes. I think what she understands most of all is, I think she understands, she attacks at everything with such a open heart. I think she understands like what is that thing that really tickles with people's feelings, and what's the most effective thing or way to do that. Like in the room we're working on the show, she referenced a lot of like when she was a child visiting the Stratford Festival, what stuff did she used to see and what was stuff that was effective for her. And I think moving from that angle versus trying to be like, oh, what is the most quote unquote commercially appealing choices, but rather what is the thing that really affected me when I was a child, because she was working from that angle. I felt that when the story came together, it was driven by joy and heart, which is something that we can all relate to, and probably something that we all desperately need right now, just with everything happening in the world. And I just thought Kat was so brilliant at doing that and actually making that into something that we can all get on board with, which you don't often go into every show having that. So that was a gift.
Absolutely. The trajectory that Kat Sandler has taken in her career as a writer, from self-producing on the backspace at Factory Theater or wherever she could, to stages at the Fringe and so on and so on and so on, to now on one of the biggest stages in Canada, is pretty impressive. But since we're talking about Canadian works, I do want to talk with you about the lifespan of New Canadian Works. You're a director. You have a theater company and called Puckers, and I we'll get to Puckers in a second or in a little bit. But I've often felt that the lifespan of Canadian Works tends to be short. One production, one and done, kind of. And I often think that's a little bit unfair to the really excellent plays that we have. But I'm curious about where you sit and how you see the lifespan of New Canadian Works.
Yeah, you absolutely, I think hit the nail on that. I still consider myself as a young artist in terms of just like my practice and also experience wise. But one of the earliest things I've noticed about our general sort of just the ecosystems of Canadian theater is that we are really centered in on this mission of how many world premieres can we get in a year. Now, I understand that historically speaking, that was sort of the initial mission with the just sort of how our arts were funded. It was under this mission and guidelines of building the Canadian identity and also like expressing what the Canadian identity is through art. So I totally understand why for such a long time we poured so much money into new play development. And now we've sort of built this culture of like, Canada is sort of the breeding ground for these new exciting voices, and people can trial and error things. And we see so many unique and distinctive voices across a span of time. And while that's all very exciting, what I felt was at an incredible, just unbalanced sort of generality is that I tend to see these really great, awesome work happen. And then I'm telling my friends or I'm telling my colleagues to go see it. And they were like, oh, but it closes like next week and I'm busy these 2 weeks, or like, oh, it closes in 2 weeks and I'm out of town from this day to this day. So I might be able to try to catch closing, but blah, blah, blah. And there was something kind of bizarre about that because, obviously, I think there's nothing wrong with when a really good show happens and it happens over 3 weeks, and if you missed it, it's kind of like there's a scarcity of that, or the rareness of that makes that play so much more exciting. While I think there's room for that, what I really did feel devastated by was that plenty of good plays that I felt was informative in my journey as a young artist, or in building me as a young artist, no longer is around, or there's any way to be referenced. It only exists in the selective members of audience's minds, and sort of when we refer to it, it's kind of like, oh yes, I look back on the show with fond memories, and I don't know, I think that's not a sustainable way for us to continue to create art. I think if we're really passionate about this idea of building the Canadian identity, or just even fostering what that culture is in terms of what are the Canadian plays, I, I do think we sort of have to look at successful examples internationally, which is looking at actually establishing a canon of work. Not that anywhere else was ever like, America or the UK ever was like, these are our canon. I don't think anybody ever said that aloud, but eventually certain plays get re-examined so often they become, or in itself forms the canon. And I'm sometimes a little devastated that we sort of don't engage our art in that capacity.
Yeah, we don't have the stages for it. We don't have a stage that because almost all of our mid-sized theaters they're worked with seasons, so they have a finite period of time to put a show on. That a show can't run for a long period of time. It can't be like in the UK where a show can run for months, or in the States, in New York where a show can run for months or years. We just don't have the stages for it. But we also don't have a pipeline for like, this show was a hit here, we're going to do it over here. It's so rare to see a show that's been performed once performed somewhere else. And that again stands in the way of creating a Canadian canon, because we never re-examine the plays. We never allow the plays to have a life outside of their initial production.
Totally. Yeah. And just looking also just like at our great writers, a few seasons ago, I think Factory had that one person play, sort of double bill of Daniel McIver plays. One was Monster and the other one was Here Lies Henry. And it was kind of incredibly refreshing because I was like, I known about these work since my time in theater school, because, in the Canadian theater landscape classes, they teach you about certain writers that we do have. But it was a bizarre thing of feeling like I may or may not ever come across those plays, because even the way it was taught to us was kind of like, oh yeah, like this premiered this year and then it sort of haven't had a production since. And and it was one of those things that when Monster and Here Lies Henry was programmed, and I went and saw it, and the person who performed Monster was a friend of mine named Carl Eng, and just to watch an actor who is like who I worked with, but also actor who I consider to be of the current generation in terms of like who's working out there, take on that piece of text that was performed so very differently when it was first performed, with new direction, with new vision, with new whatever. It made me really excited about revisiting these sort of canon of works that was successful once upon a time. Yeah, and I just wish for it not to be something that only comes across every once in a while because certain theater is under certain financial needs, or certain theater was feeling whatever, but that there, like you said, that there's spaces or stages for these plays to have a longer life. Because although selfishly speaking, there are certainly plays that I've performed in that I've been like, gosh, that was such a good time. I wish I could do that again, or I wish more audiences got to see that story and be moved by it and be impacted by it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, somebody being able to tackle a text by Daniel McIver and bring their own interpretation to it with the director and just their own talent, their own take on it. It's something we get to do with Shakespeare sometimes, but so rarely with our own work. I've seen a few of Daniel McIver's solo plays, from Wild Abandon to House. I saw him perform House in his farewell tour. And these are texts that are so poetic and dense and wonderful that we should be able to have as many actors as possible tackle these, and that's the case with so many other Canadian plays as well, we should get to see them again. I think it's great that Kim's Convenience has been touring with like new people taking on those roles. As iconic as Paul Sun-Hyung Lee is in the role of Appa, it is good to see Ince, who coincidentally was the son in the original production, now old enough to take on the role of Appa. But it's fascinating, like, just to see like these shows get another opportunity, and it's a rare and beautiful thing.
Yes, but also like, but also when it came back, and this is the thing that I sort of feel for a lot in these opportunities, which is when that show came back and I saw it. I didn't see the original version because I wasn't living in Toronto at the time. But having seen the new production, even as a person who didn't see the original production, I was excited by that. Not only just the thing you mentioned of like Inns playing the son, but now playing the dad, but to see that play have a new life. Just like a life that's beyond sort of like what it was 20 years ago. I mean, this is to say that Kim's Convenience have also fortunately have had multiple different lives in different places, because it's considered one of those plays that's a little bit easier to do in terms of finding an audience for and whatnot. But I really do wish and hope more plays sort of got to have that chance and have that lifespan, and that we weren't as concerned about how fast or how limited amount of limited time we have to get a production up, but that to think about the longevity of the production. Because I also think, because we are so passionate about new play development, often what happens is that you get these fantastic new plays, and I'm speaking as somebody who's worked on a good number of them in workshops. You get these fantastic new plays who are in workshop, and they're just in development hell. Like a play that's written 10 years ago is still being developed to this day, just waiting for that like next step to get produced and get programmed. And then the moment that it's programmed, it happens for 3 weeks, and then we don't see it ever again. And I also go, 3 weeks also isn't, realistic speaking, a sufficient amount of time for the writer even to understand whether if there are stuff in the play that fully works. So for me, I also go like, I think of that story of Tony Kushner making amendments to Angels in America. I think something like 10 years or like 12, 13 years after it's published. I was like, there's something about that I love as well, that because we're in this business and we understand that the things that we create is a living organism, and that as long as you as the creator of that living organism is alive, that there should be an opportunity or a chance given to you to edit, to adjust, to recontextualize. I know Tony Kushner felt that there was stuff that he was written that felt relevant at the time that it was written, but then 10, 12, 13 years later, it actually did not sit with him the same way that it did 10 years ago. And yeah, and I know Daniel McIver made a little, or at least I heard that he made small edits to Monster and Here Lies Henry when it was produced again. And I just find that beautiful. I think the reinvestment of artists is equally as interesting, if not worth to have that conversation, than also new art and new artists and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I think it's great when a writer can revisit work, especially when they've had the opportunity to see it lived in by different people, to have it breathe, to have even just like have even a single actor who lives in that part for more than 3 weeks, for like a month, 2 months, 3 months, because that performer then learns much more about that role, and what they've learned about the role infuses how they play it going forward, until the playwright can then take a look at it and they can have a realization. I didn't realize that about my own play, and they can then make adjustments and things like that. And Danny McIver, who's performed his plays so many times, he has embodied those and knows those well as well. But they've also been performed. He's one of the rare playwrights who's had their plays performed multiple times.
Yeah.
And it's one of those rare things in this country.
Yes, and I just think we should do that way more frequently than we are right now. Again, I do think new plays are great. I love working on new plays, and it's truly where my work mostly lies. But it is frustrating some to feel that again. If you're in a mid-sized company, it's 3 week run. If you're a Tarragon, you get an extra week for previews. But then you get just even a slightly smaller size than a mid-sized company. Sometimes your run is for 2 weeks, and that's just for the amount of time that is put into the production, it's just brutal. That's all.
It 100% is brutal. It's really kind of rough. And there's no, there are plays that are written in the UK and in the US that then get productions here. It just doesn't go the other way. There's no pipeline within the country or even external to the country to take these plays and give them a life, which is really quite tragic.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I do hope that as we continue to invest our time in Canadian art, that this is a conversation that, it's also for me. I also go like, as excited I am that there's always such a focus towards story about people in my generation and young stories and young people, and that we deserve to shape the future of whatever. I'm often feeling a sense of like, right, but there were also paths that was laid out for me by the folks who came long before I did, and it sometimes feel weird that we, in order to prioritize one, we have to sacrifice the other. And I just think there is a common ground that we can reach in terms of preserving stuff that really strongly works while trying to elevate new ideas, much like we do with Shakespeare. Right.
Yeah,
that those texts are now treated with a sense of, or not with the same sense of sort of that reverence as what it once was. And I think, and I hope Canadian arts can one day achieve that legacy as well.
Maybe if we can find our ways to bring in the new audiences, the people who don't go, and show them what theater can be, that maybe then more theaters will open and more work can get done. But we have to start with bringing people in, and sometimes that's an uphill battle because a lot of theaters are combating the people who are currently buying tickets. And if I can't sacrifice these people for the people who haven't yet bought tickets, but I need to bring in new people, and it's a juggling game.
Yeah, it's a whole thing. I'm sure there's so much more nuance in that I don't have the full context or grasp of, but it's certainly something that I'm really invested in learning about, especially trying to step into more of a artistic leadership role and such.
Speaking of artistic leadership, let's talk about Puckers. Tell me about your theater company.
Yes. So this is a new theater company I launched this year. We're doing our premiere production in the theater center from October 8th to October 12th, which I'm not sure if by the time that this podcast goes up, if we'll still be running, but probably not, because I'm guessing this. I don't know.
Well, unfortunately, that show will be closed by that time, but
that's okay. Yeah, but that's we're launching our company this year, and that's the first show that we're doing. And it sort of started as I think I knew that I wanted to sort of go into artistic leadership when I was leaving school. When I graduated, I had an inkling that it was something that I was interested in, because I had a really strong investment in terms of new work, strong investment in terms of the Canadian theater landscape, and was very interested in having or being a part of that dialogue of how do we create art, and why do we program what we program, and how do we continually reinvest in the arts that we're making. So I knew that I wanted to step into those leadership roles, but also simultaneously have felt at a great disadvantage, because I don't know that it's something that's immediately accessible to young people who have those kind of dreams. I think, in chatting with a lot of mentors who are artistic leaders, what of all the patterns that I keep sensing is that a lot of folks sort of fell into those positions later on in their career, versus having had really strong a desire or ambition for it from the very beginning. So one of my mentors, who's Ray Hogg, who was the last artistic director of Musical Stage Co., has sort of said to me that there's not really like one direct path towards becoming an artistic leader. You just have to start calling yourself one and start proving that it's something that you can do. And then when the right job opportunity comes along, you're able to offer up the experiences and the things that you've done as an example, or, as something that can back up your argument. And I had a thought about that. And my business partner, whose name is Ali McKinsey, we went to school together. And during our entire time in school together, we have sort of always connected on all things arts related, how arts should be made, how does art play a part in our society, what, like that, the community aspect of art making. That when we came out of the pandemic, which was 2022, we had sort of the first initial conversations about wanting to build something together, wanting to invest in something together that perhaps could be something that two of us can continuously invest in over a period of time. And then in November of 2024, we finally chatted about that and then decided to launch this year so that we can start to get practice in as young artistic leaders and trying to start programming work and engaging with the industry in a way that is not just as our profession, but as actual art makers, and to be able to dialogue about work in a capacity that feels larger than just in our living room. So yeah, so that's why we formed Puckers. It's very exciting. We're excited to continue to take it to new heights.
Can I ask you where the name comes from?
Yes. Okay, so this is a short and long story. I'll try to keep it concise. But what you need to know is that when I immigrated to Canada, one of my English name, because Steven is not my birth name, but an English name that was assigned to me. But one of my alternate English name was almost the name Lemon, which is a much longer story, right? But because of that, sort of I've always incorporated lemon into my personal branding, just in terms of like I always, when we do icebreakers of like, what's one thing people don't know about you? I've always made sure that was the fact. Told a lot of people about this fact. And so then when I was sort of thinking about creating a theater company, I was really looking at the title of Lemonade Stand, because I think I liked how scrappy it sounded, and that I play with the lemon thing. And then my business partner, Ali, who is much more savvy in the conversations of branding and also just brand identity than I am, we had a conversation regarding like Lemonade Stand is great, but it's also not like super distinct, right? Like it can be easily confused as not a company, but like a lemonade stand, and also the other things that's quite a mouthful. So then we sort of start having this conversation of like, what is the thing that we want to be remembered by? What is the thing that with the work that we make? What is that? What does that have to do with our audiences? And the only thing we sort of really landed on and could agree upon is that we wanted people leaving our shows or our performances feeling that they were strongly impacted, so much so that there is a visceral reaction. So then we started thinking about a name that implied an emotion immediately. And then we circled back to lemons. And we realized that, when you taste something really sour, or when you eat something really sweet, there is this like impulsive thing you do with your lips, which is you pucker up kind of a little bit. And also I think like puckering up is such an intimate facial reaction as well. We just felt that not only captured the lemon thing that we were working with, it simultaneously captured the sort of the essence of the work that we want to make, that it makes you pucker. So then suddenly we were on that route, and eventually we landed on Puckers with an apostrophe, because we liked the idea that everything was impossessive. So it was like something that we had, it was this company's thing. So, but it's Puckers thing. So that's how we landed on our name.
Love it. I love stories like that. I love stories about how things get named. You were talking about the leadership pipeline, and it occurred to me as you were talking about that is, in a lot of cases, if you're in theater school, the idea of being an artistic leader is not even something that comes up, right? It is not something, especially when you're in theater school. How many people go into theater school thinking, I want to be an artistic director? I think it's a very rare thing that people consider, but so it's hard to get somebody on that track in theater school and figure out what that is. But then, like, as you said, after, when somebody starts to want to do that, how do you learn? How do you figure out what that is? What is the pathway to becoming an artistic leader?
Yeah, I think it's such a bizarre thing. I think number one, not even just to say that this theater school institutions or any kind of institution, not even if you're just in for a conservatory training or even if you're in like a drama program, the role of the artistic director is almost never discussed. And simultaneously, at least in Canada, I'm actually not sure everywhere else, but at least in Canada, it is one of the most thankless jobs in the theater scene. I think it does come with a slightly higher paycheck than some of the other positions, but simultaneously, I do believe that it's one of the most thankless jobs because they're sometimes not immediately the face of, oh, they directed this really great show in this season, or that, oh, they were in this super great show in this season. That I think as general audiences, we don't always sort of associate the idea of like what happens in a theater space with the artistic director. I think that's like really heavy industry talk. I think it's like if you're in the industry, you're really familiar with the idea, but if you're out of the industry, I think a lot of people have confusions about what that position really is. But yeah, I was really shocked and surprised by how there was no sort of path into it and or sort of training around it. You just kind of have to like have all these sets of skills, but there's no like gathered place to teach all those things. Like as an art director, you probably have to have really strong people skills, which like you could argue that being an actor teaches you, right? But at the same time, it's also like you need to have a strong financial understandings of how to bring in money, how to spend money. You need to have a really strong sense of your company's mission statement, right? So that you could guide your company towards new heights. You need to understand who are the people that are working in this industry as. You need to understand who to bring in to direct your shows. You need to understand, how to produce a successful season. And there's all these like little nuance and actually larger contextual things that I think, yeah, that you sort of don't have a direct pipeline to learn about, which can be quite frustrating. Which is why also establishing Puckers is just really an excuse or an opportunity for me to start learning about those things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the other thing is an artistic director often has to deal with donors, often has to be talking to donors and like putting the that personal touch into conversations with the money people and this, that, and the other thing. It is not a 9 to 5 job. It is a 12-hour a day job, especially at large companies. And we sort of go back and forth in Canada where I know for years there was a period of time at the Canadian stage where they were getting a lot of flack because the artistic director hadn't worked in Canada. They worked in the UK and they came back here. We sort of go through these cycles in Canada where the artistic leadership for a period of time seems to come from outside of the country, which again makes it hard for somebody who's in the country and trying to learn this as a skill to actually get the education and the knowledge that they need to be able to do that themselves. It's a really tough one because of that.
Yes, incredibly so. And again, there's no. I think what's really exciting now is that I think Canadian companies are starting to maybe realize that a little bit. I'm starting to see a bit of a pattern. Crow's Theater being a prime example of that, where it seems to become clear that that there was a Paolo, who was recently named the artistic director of Soul Pepper, sort of went through this really nice pipeline that Crows has sort of built off, where he was the sort of associate to the company to begin with, and that sort of promoted him into being the associate artistic director, and then from there on in, sort of this step up into the artistic leadership role at Soul Pepper. And I think more theater companies, if we want to continue to foster a really strong artistic culture, and we want to think about the strong legacies of a company, I think theater companies in Canada need to start having more awareness of how we can involve young, passionate arts leaders and arts crafters to insert themselves into that business, so that we have again longevity and legacy to continue to build on top of each other.
It's so important because one of the things that will happen is if we don't foster this, people will leave the industry. Some of our most talented people will leave the industry and go into a private industry. They'll join a company where they can use their skills, or they can make more money, or whatever it is.
100%. And because it's already such a, like our business is so dependent on your relationship with people. When we lose those people, it's extra devastating because it's like not only are you losing like a really talented or passionate worker, a lot of times you're losing a friend, into from away from this field. And yeah, and I don't personally like to see that. So
No. Who likes to see somebody who's put a lot of years, a lot of time, and a lot of talent into something just go, I can make more money somewhere else?
yes.
I want to take a second and just sort of like step away from some of these larger topics to talk a little bit more about you and your journey in theater. How did you discover theater, and how did you decide that it was something you were going to do?
Sure. I didn't come to discover theater until I was in high school. I sort of known that I was gonna be a performer of sorts since the age of 8. I was on a trip with my family, and we were in France because there was a business conference that my dad had to attend. And then I remember being in France, and I mind you, I was 8 and didn't speak. I hadn't even started speaking English then. I was only Mandarin was the only language I could speak then. And I was like staying in the hotel because we were there for, I think, for 48 hours. And then for the entire 40 hours, obviously I couldn't leave the hotel. So I was just in the hotel the whole time while I was in France. And then the hotel TV was playing Patch Adams, the Robin Williams movie. And I remember seeing clips of that movie and being like, oh, whatever that is, I want to be that. But I didn't know sort of I didn't know the language, I didn't know the film, I didn't know what was happening in the film. All I remembered was that he put on a red nose. So then when I went back to China and when I went into grade 4, we had to do this sort of like careers class kind of thing, which is also incredibly Chinese, which is by grade 4, you're like, figure out what you want to do when you are, when you're becoming an adult, and all my classmates was doing these topics on like, health worker and like, I want to be a business person or whatever. I did my presentation on wanting to be a clown. And then I was sort of publicly ridiculed for it by my teacher in front of my whole class. And I just remember being like, oh, okay, like I definitely feel a strong inkling to this. And if anything, I definitely feel a stronger connection to it now that I've been made fun of. Because it was also one of those weird things where after I got made fun of, I was like, oh, like I'm not ashamed by it, but I actually felt like I really cared about it. And then eventually, a few years down the line, when I immigrated, I was attending a public school, and then I had really enjoyed doing like class presentation. I had always been a pretty extroverted kid, and I discovered improv. And then a couple of my friends in improv was like, "Oh, you should audition for the school musical." And then I was like, "What's a musical?" And they were like, "Oh, it's it's like theater." And I was like, "What is that?" And then they were sort of like making, just telling me sort of what it is. And I was like, "Oh, I kind of know what that is because there's Chinese theater." Although I think Chinese theater is quite different from the North American theater. And then I auditioned for my first musical ever when I was in grade 9 for the musical Grease, and it was the school musical. And I just remember like absolutely falling in love with the process of building a show. And then subsequent year, I started taking singing lessons, started taking dancing lessons, and then just one thing rolled into another. And then suddenly I was doing it, and suddenly I was booking professional contracts outside of school. And all of a sudden, I was in grade 11, and I told my drama teacher that I wanted to become like a full blown like full time actor. And I grew up in Victoria, BC. This is a missing piece of this. But and then my drama teacher at the time was like, okay, if you want to do that, you have to leave Victoria because Victoria is too small. Like there's not enough work here. Like if you want to do that, you have to go to like a big city like Toronto. So then went to Toronto. I went to a Ryerson University, or now called TMU. But at the time I went, it was still called Ryerson. Did their conservatory program, and then since then have been very lucky to continue to work in the industry and continue to work at places like Stratford and Kansas State, Tarragon, all these wonderful, wonderful locations. So yeah, it's been a fruitful journey.
That's quite a journey. That's quite a journey. I'm looking at some of the stuff that you have upcoming. I mean, here you're directing Shifting Ground Collective's Dora award-winning Shifting Ground Collective's Ride the Cyclone, which I think is on right now as we're recording this.
That's correct. Yeah.
And you've got Concord Floral, which is with your company, Puckers. You've got work at Crow's Theater. You're going to be you're doing your third season at the Stratford Festival. That's quite a lot coming up. How are you balancing all of that? And I hate asking people and I don't. I love asking people to choose which one of their babies they like the best. Which one of these things are you looking the most forward to right now today?
Oh gosh, that's such a good question to ask. Because like obviously every single time I get to come across an opportunity, I'm excited about the next thing that's coming up, and that's always going to remain true. But I will say, because in my own artistic journey, I'm so invested in being a director right now, that the things that I'm really looking forward to in this current moment of us recording is Concord Floral, just to sort of share the vision of that show with a public audience, and also like really launching sort of the company. That feels really super exciting and a top priority for me. But I'm always so excited for everything coming up. Like what I love is when I'm able to finish a contract and just towards the end of it start to get excited about the next thing coming up, which is also a privilege. I acknowledge of like being a working artist, and there's always something to look forward to.
Yeah. I mean, we mentioned before we started recording that you were, as you're finishing the Stratford season, you're spending sort of like half your time in Stratford, some of your time in Toronto. So you're like easing back into the Toronto scene from a summer at Stratford. But is there a culture shock that comes from like leaving the Stratford bubble and going back into the Toronto scene? What's that process been like?
Yes, totally. I mean, first and foremost, Stratford, you have so much resource, right? Like there's so much time, so much like so many people working on your project. You have time you can spend away thinking about your work before you come back to it. You preview for a month. It's unheard of here. It's unheard of in Toronto. So definitely, like whenever I sort of ease myself back in or reinsert myself back into the Toronto scene, it's always like, remembering how fast everything needs to be, and sort of like, right, we actually don't have time to dwell on decisions. We have to make decisions and try to get to the next decision before we're at lunch, So that's definitely been like a bit of a sort of switch. But simultaneously, also much more exciting stuff is happening because, Stratford, you sort of get this thing of like, you kind of have to have an idea for what the show is much longer before you begin. Whereas I think Toronto, because of how fast everything sort of happens, there's a really exciting aspect of like, the work that we're engaging with just feels much more risky, that it was not something that was premeditated. It feels something that's quite like, right, this show is going to try to do this thing. And the purpose of it it might not connect with everyone and it might upset people, but that's kind of like the goal, or that's kind of like what the angle is. And so that's also quite refreshing. Yeah, I don't prefer one place over the other, but I do like that I get to sort of dip my toes in on both sides.
And it's exciting to know that you'll be going back to Stratford again for the next season. How does it feel to sort of have settled into, or do you settle into like the Stratford cadence when you're heading back for your third season?
Yeah, I mean, Stratford is so amazing because while it's a lot of work there, it is also an institution that I think forces you to slow down as an artist, especially if you're traveling from out of town. Because suddenly there is a financial security in that. There is like, you're getting paid to work and to work very hard. But also at the same time, it's also like, again, you're rehearsing more than one show at a time. And each show sort of, you could just spend like 3 whole months on it before you open. So it sort of forces you to slow down into really understanding what you need to do in your work to develop, to deliver and develop really strong work for the stage. So that's really refreshing. Toronto, you don't sort of get that kind of privilege of time, but but it's also tricky because Stratford, when it comes down to it, it is a tourist town, which means that when the tourists come, it's when the town feels the most alive and feels the most whatever. But during your rehearsal periods, which is often in the winter, everything closes at 7. you finish rehearsals, there's nowhere to hang out. You just kind of go home and you read a book and go to bed, which as a young person can sometimes feel quite frustrating in terms of wanting to, go out and wanting to spend time hanging out with your coworkers, which is the other major thing, right? So many Stratford actors are often folks who also has been there for a long time and who lives there. So a lot of time you finish rehearsal, you go, anybody want to grab a drink? And then a lot of them will go, no, I have to go home to my kid and wife, right? Which is such a different culture, culturally different.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, Steven, thank you so much for talking. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks so much for giving me some time tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. This was the absolute best. Thank you for your questions, and it was very, very fun talking to you as well.